Today I'm in San Antonio, Texas, where the American Association of Law Libraries is holding its annual meeting. We are sitting in the Riverfront Marriott Hotel, and I'm speaking with Terry Martin, Harry S. Martin III, technically. Terry was the director, or law librarian, I believe it's called, or librarian technically, at the Harvard Law School library from 1981 until he retired in 2008. After his retirement, Terry moved down here to Texas and now resides near Austin, and filled in for a couple of years at the University of Texas Tarleton Law Library as interim director after the death of his mentor, and mentor to many of those in our profession, Roy M. Mirsky. Terry, I'm delighted to have you join us today and talk to you here for the Oral History Project.
Thanks, Pat. Good to be here.
Thank you. Before we sort of get into the nuts and bolts of your career and service and things like that, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, perhaps about your life when you were young and today?
Well, I grew up in Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
Both my parents were language teachers. My mother taught Latin, my father taught French. They moved around a lot when I was young, but we settled in Minnesota, and that's where I went to school. I took both Latin from my mother in the summers and French from my father in school, which was an interesting experience. It was a large high school, but I still decided to take the French class. But the most significant class I had in high school was band. I really got interested in music. I started out playing the cornet, and then in the 8th grade I was encouraged to switch to the euphonium so I could get into the top band and march in the Rose Bowl parade in 1963.
That must have been an experience.
Yeah, that was. It was a great experience. Minnesota and Wisconsin were vying for the Big Ten championship that year, and we were the only band, the only group of kids in the whole state that was rooting for Wisconsin, because if Minnesota had won, then the university band would have gone to the Rose Bowl parade.
You would have got bumped.
We would have gotten bumped. But Washington won. I think eventually they lost in the Rose Bowl in a very thrilling, high-scoring game. But we got to go to represent Minnesota in the Tournament of Roses parade, wearing our wool uniforms in California. Which
Pasadena, California.
Well, at
warm for that.
At 4:30 in the morning, when we locked up, it was very comfortable.
Yeah.
But by the time the parade started and it warmed up, we got quite hot. And then it turned out that the parade was over 7 miles long.
Oh,
And
you must have all been ruined by the
we were pretty. A good friend of mine who played tuba, who also came over from the junior high to play this band, you know. After the parade was almost over, although we didn't know it, and it turned a corner and the road just kind of went up the mountain in front of us, and at that point he just said, well, I'm out of here, and he dropped out. A Jeep came by and picked him up, and 1 block later the parade ended, and we all razzed him about that. But that was a formative experience. I had a very good band director, and so I continued to play various brass instruments all through university.
And then you continue today, I believe.
I continue today, and I played through law school. And when I graduated from law school, I had this was during the Vietnam era, so I had the choice of the Army band, playing marches in Washington for 4 years. Because I was quite good, and I was convinced I could make it. Or the Peace Corps, and I decided the Peace Corps, and I talked to the head of Selective Service in Minnesota, and his daughter was a volunteer in Togo, and he tried to dissuade me from it because he said it was too difficult. But
You thought dragging yourself around the swamps in South
Well-
Vietnam would be easier?
no, he thought I should play in the Army Band in Washington
Oh.
4 years.
Yeah.
But the Peace Corps had a couple programs for lawyers, and he gave us his blessing, and so we were accepted into the Peace Corps. I got married to the woman I met in junior high school, and we went into the Peace Corps. She taught elementary school, and I taught at the University of Liberia Law School,
Mm-hmm.
and that was a good experience. But at this point, I didn't own a horn because I'd always borrowed, nice expensive instruments from the university.
Mm-hmm.
So she went to a pawn shop and bought me a trumpet for $35.
Mm-hmm.
And then the years go by and I buy more trumpets, and by the time we're in the Boston area, I'm playing with a lot of community orchestras and bands, and then I eventually bought a French horn and started learning that, and that's what I'm playing a lot now. Although I'm in Austin, I'm the president of the Austin Brass Band, which is a British-style brass band, and in that I play the tenor horn, or the E-flat alto horn, as we call it in the United States, and it's a lot of fun. So I play in a polka band and a wind ensemble and an orchestra and the British Brass Band.
Sounds like your repertoire of music is pretty broad. I mean, it's limited to a variety of, group of instruments, but
Yeah, I play
Texas
most of the brass instruments. When we moved to Washington in 1976,
I remember you came to Georgetown. To
that's
be
right. The
head director.
the publicity director for the Washington Post contacted a lot of bands that were marching in the bicentennial parade and asked them if they would be willing to play the Washington Post March, and none of them agreed. So he founded his own band, the Washington Post Band, founded for the sole purpose of playing the Washington Post March in the bicentennial parade. And I played trombone in that band. And it's the only time I've ever played trombone in public, I think. But that was fun. But so music has been an active part of my life, and my wife's life. She was a very good percussion player, and she now plays in a steel band in Austin, Texas. So that keeps us pretty active.
Does her steel band ever participate in parades? Because I remember
No.
some where they were on a flatbed truck often.
It's a big deal in Trinidad, during
Okay.
Carnival, but they perform a lot, but it's all only stationary, and it's a fun thing. We didn't know that before we moved to Austin that there were any steel bands in Austin, and it turns out that there are probably more steel bands in Austin than any other city in the U.S. and high schools, junior
Austin
highs.
is supposed to be a very interesting city. I mean, there's an awful lot going on.
Well, they bill themselves as the live music capital of the world, but they usually mean something involving a guitar, But even if you don't play guitar, there's a number of interesting things going on, and it's a very active scene. It was when we were there in the '70s, and it still is. So.
It's a little more congested on the roads, I suspect, today. There seems to be a lot of development and
Yes,
growth
there's a lot.
around
It's grown
Austin.
north and south quite a bit. The traffic is something everybody complains about, but actually, compared to Boston, the traffic is really nothing.
That's true.
That's one of the reasons we decided to stay there, because no snow, and the traffic is not really so bad.
Yeah. Well, when I retired, I wanted to relocate back to where I grew up, Seattle, Washington, but I realized I didn't have to get downtown to an office every morning, so I could live someplace a little, shall we say, less congested and intense.
Yeah.
And so I'm 50 miles south in Olympia, and traffic is nicer there, I can tell you.
That's the capital, isn't it?
It's the capital, yes.
Yeah, Roy Mirsky actually was the librarian there
He
many,
was
many years ago.
at the
Supreme Court.
Supreme Court Library in the Temple of Justice.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful neck of the woods too. Yeah.
Thank you, yeah.
Did you watch the game last night between the
No, I
Seattle
wasn't-
Sounders?
No, I wasn't able, I haven't figured out how to use the TV in the
Ah,
room, and I don't generally watch my, certainly on my phone, the picture's so small, although I do have an iPad and I
Yeah.
can watch it on that, I guess.
well, the other thing I'm doing in retirement is watching a lot of soccer. 'Cause I played soccer since I was young and all through law school actually.
Well, it's interesting, this is, of course, we've just finished the World Cup
Mhm.
in Brazil this summer, which I think occurs, every 4 years.
Yeah.
And the U.S. had a team that actually got past the first round.
Yes, we did reasonably well. Almost beat Belgium. Well, I had actually picked to win the whole thing, but
Yeah.
I think
Well,
next
Seattle
next 4
had a
years-
guy playing in that who was pretty good, too.
Yes, he was. Yeah, Clint Dempsey, a Texan
Yeah,
actually.
well, we're not sure we're gonna keep him in Seattle. The rumors are going around that he's gonna end up someplace in Europe, probably.
Back in Europe?
Where he
Well,
can,
right. Maybe he
you
will.
know, be a little more prominent in the game.
Yeah. I think your fullback, DeAndre Yeltsin, is probably bound for Europe
Mhm.
because he was a revelation. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went to the European Championships in Porto, and I went to the European Championships in Switzerland, and considered going to the World Cup, but decided not to.
Well, it's interesting to watch soccer, the interest in soccer develop more and more in this country. I know, I suppose some of that is people are coming from other places where it is big. It's big every place else except
Yeah.
pretty much here. And it's probably normal for them to, keep their
Well,
interests, and then it
Soccer
develops.
has actually been the most popular youth sport in the United States for decades,
Mhm.
and it's just never been able to translate into, a top professional league.
Well, the television networks are always looking for things, sports being a big thing, that people will like to watch live, so they can't sit there and record and then fast forward all the commercials.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be surprised if soccer telecasts became more common and more highly watched over the
I
years.
hope so, because right now I have to pay a lot of extra to get various foreign leagues
Yeah.
to watch.
Well,
but
that won't change.
probably not.
Not unless the cable companies
Yeah,
find they can't make enough money that way. And
yeah,
it's like the airlines, all these little add-on fees for this, that, and the other thing. And,
yes,
they find things you really kind of think you don't want to do without, so you pay the
Exactly.
fee and don't
Exactly.
complain. We've been talking about your life and some of your interests. Do you have anything besides music and soccer that are passions in life that you enjoy doing, especially now that you're retired?
well, I got interested in teaching art law at Harvard
Uh-huh.
maybe in the mid-90s, and I still keep up with that. I started a seminar there, and I'm teaching a seminar in Texas, and so it's an interesting field. There's always something in the New York Times almost every week about some new case of repatriation
Mm.
or copyright or
That's right. There was
theft or
recently a
something.
big one where they had a fellow's son who'd been actually his
Yes.
father had been with the
Yes,
Nazis. So they had
Cornelius.
all these artworks, and the question was, could they really figure out which ones he owned and which ones had been stolen?
That's right, Cornelius Gurlitt, the Gurlitt Trove, they call it.
Yeah.
1,400 works, I think. And Gurlitt had been one of the main dealers for the Nazis,
Mm-hmm.
kind of trading art they didn't like for art they did like. And it'll take, certainly some of that collection has material that the Nazis looted and will have to be returned, but some of it doesn't. So
Yeah.
separating the wheat from the chaff is going to take a lot of time, because these are difficult issues and very fact dependent.
And unfortunately, many of the owners of that era are not only not around, but
No.
the Nazis made sure they weren't around
That's right.
to press their claims or whatever.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area, and considering that 80 years have passed, it's almost surprising it's still hot. But then you look at some of these antiquities that surface, and you know, tomb robbing has been going on for thousands of years.
Well, they're even getting the British Museum to send stuff back to its original country, Egypt
Yes,
or wherever.
That's a challenge, but
Yeah.
many museums are doing it voluntarily. So
Well, not all of them probably are thrilled to be doing it.
no. For the British Museum, it actually takes an act of Parliament, so it is rather tricky.
I remember one time, Carol, my late wife, and I were in London, and in library school we studied things like the Rosetta Stone and so on. So we went to the British Museum, and there it was.
That's
And,
right.
You know, and it wasn't behind glass and bulletproof glass or anything. It was right out there where you could sort of touch it if you wanted to, and I was really impressed as well as surprised by the accessibility that museum gave to that
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah, and the Louvre, I mean, Napoleon basically was, in the modern area, probably the first great looter.
Mm-hmm.
Of course,
Well,
to go back to the Romans, I mean, they mastered the art too, so.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting field. I was able to interest Kathy Price in this field, and she started teaching it when she was at Florida, and then I think 3 or 4 other librarians have decided it's an interesting field for them to get into. So there's actually a lot of little
In some
art law
ways,
seminars across the country.
probably not that different from our regular day jobs in some ways, the organizing and
No.
enjoying.
No, well, particularly when I was at Harvard, I found out I was running kind of a small museum, so it was an area that actually had some practical aspects to it. We can talk about that later, perhaps.
Yesterday, I had the opportunity to speak with Dan Wade from Yale Law School
Mhm.
Library, and one of the titles he has now is curator. And he's very pleased with that title, he said, actually. And in a way, that's what we do. You certainly, when you were at Harvard, had that kind of a collection where there would be things that you'd be more of a curator
Yes, yeah.
than a normal librarian
Yes.
working with.
Well, Roscoe Pound was a major figure in the history of Harvard,
Mhm.
particularly in American law in general. But when he was on the library committee as a faculty member, he was a great advocate for them buying any collection that came on the market. And when he became dean, he extended this to artworks too. And if you look at the history of the Harvard art collection, and it just, during the 20 years Pound was dean, just spiked
Oh,
incredibly much. And you know, they've kept it up at a more modest rate since, but they have a huge collection of portraits and objects relating to the law, statutes and wigs, lawyers' wigs, judicial wigs, you know, any kind of memorabilia. And we had the lunch box that Oliver Wendell Holmes, you know, used at the Supreme Court. It had been his powder box, his ammunition box when he was in the Civil War. So it was metal, you know.
okay.
And we had a pistol that he used in the Civil War. It was still cocked when I arrived at Harvard. And I remember we debated years what to do about that.
Let's hope it was not loaded too.
Well, we never knew.
We hadn't checked that part.
No, and then, you know, Harvard being Harvard, visiting dignitaries would come and make presents, and so we had a Saudi sword, and we had a lot of, you know, odd things, and trying to keep all these things together, and it was an interesting job. I actually
And
used
you
to.
thought of yourself as a law librarian
Well,
still,
you know.
with all those other things on the side?
But that's been the interesting part of the career. You know, you start out with an image of this, and it just kind of expands. I wasn't even sure I wanted to be a librarian. I intended to be a lawyer, basically. I thought I would go back to Minnesota and practice. There was a lawyer in western Minnesota who was getting ready to retire. He was a sole practitioner, and he had a little practice there. And he said, well, you know, come out and, you know, join me, and you'll be the second lawyer in the county, and when I retire, you'll be the only lawyer in the county, and it's a good life, you know. And yeah, I was expecting that, but actually it was the Peace Corps that got me interested in libraries, because Liberia was unofficially the American colony in Africa, never officially.
It was sort of established, wasn't it, originally, so that they could repatriate slaves from
Yes,
this country.
that's
They could
right.
send
It
them back
was
there.
settled in the, started in the 1820s, I think, when freed slaves were from the United States were sent back. The Americo-Liberian Colonization Society was actually headquartered in Boston, because the northern businessmen didn't want all these freed slaves flooding their cities, and cheap labor, and, you know, racial imbalance and all this stuff. And eventually the American Navy started intercepting slave ships, you know, after the British. The British would take slaves they'd found on the high seas and take them back to Liberia, to Freetown, Sierra Leone. And the Americans then began depositing them next door in Liberia. And the capital of Liberia was named Monrovia after James Monroe, who was the president at the time.
I think there's still, the name is still in use.
Yeah, still Monrovia. And the government was modeled very much after the United States. In fact, a Harvard law professor, Simon Greenleaf, wrote the first constitution for Liberia. And they now have a new one. But American law was very important. When I joined the faculty there, 1969, they had just passed a new commercial law based on New York commercial law, which meant based on the Uniform Commercial Code.
Okay.
And that was one of the courses I was given, was commercial law. And fortunately, I had a very good commercial law professor at the University of Minnesota. And so I actually knew a little bit about the subject, and I quickly learned a lot more.
I'll bet you it had to be a quick study.
But one of the things I remember that he did when it came to commercial paper was he spent several classes explaining the banking system, which we didn't know, because if you know how the system works, you can understand a little more about you know, checks and letters of credit and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So I started doing that too, and I took my class. It was only about probably 17, 18 in the class, and we went down. I had a friend who worked in the Citibank in Monrovia. He was actually the trombone player in our brass quartet.
Oh,
we had a brass
second
quartet.
little link there.
We had a brass quartet. And so I arranged for them to go down, and if they didn't have a checking account yet, and most of them didn't, they all opened a checking account, you know, for at least $1. And then I made everybody write a check to the next person, you know, and give it to them, and then we just followed the procedure of how, you know, how the deposit worked, and then how your check worked, and how it was paid.
Well, I suppose when you actually do a transaction, it becomes a lot more real.
I think
how
so.
it all operates.
And then when we started talking about, you know, the situation later, they could understand. Of course, it was a very difficult class to teach, because about half the class were extremely well educated. They'd gone to a school in the United States. They'd gone to college in the United States or England, then come back and had positions in, one was the editor of the local newspaper, another was the head of the radio television company, and a couple of them were government officials. But the other half of the class had just gone to school all the way in Liberia, local schools, local university, and they just didn't have as good an education. And so it was, some of them were quite bright. One of them actually later became the Chief Justice of Liberia. But it
Must have been, having such a wide type of variety of backgrounds for the students and experiences must have been difficult to sort of do it so you didn't lose one group at the expense of
well, there were
the other being
but
taken
they were
care of.
all relatively mature, even the ones that had gone to school. You know, they'd all had interesting experiences, so the trick was to bring out their experiences and get them to share it. And one of the things the school did every summer, or during the long class break, was we would go to a different part of the country and run training sessions for the justices of the peace, because the Liberians had passed a statute that made tribal chiefs, you know, the traditional kind of community leaders and dispute resolvers, had given them the titles of justices of the peace.
All right.
And folded them into the official, the formal legal system. But they could still decide certain kinds of cases based on traditional law, but other kinds of cases, particularly those would be classed as criminal law cases, had to be decided according to national law. And so we would go out and run training programs for the justices of the peace, you know, and this included some of the, you know, senior instructors at the law school, but it also included a number of, you know, a couple of us young Peace Corps types who hadn't even really practiced yet. And that was actually a wonderful learning experience, because we would go and they would have questions about the statute and about the act and about what they were supposed to do, and so we'd come up with hypotheticals, and they'd say, well, how would you decide that? And I would say, well, I would probably decide it this way and this way. And I said, well, that's pretty good, because I had a case like that, and then they'd go back 20 years when they were resolving a dispute, you know.
A little experience in the world.
and they could say, but in that case, you know, this thing happened, and I would say, ooh, I don't know what I would do in that case. So it was actually a very good experience. And we liked the people, we liked the food, and had a good time there. You know, later on they had a bad political situation, a civil war that killed most of my students, actually, and
Yeah,
some
that's
of my
too bad.
colleagues.
The tragedy of a lot of those countries is they
Yeah.
come along.
Yeah, well, it taught me that the civilization is really a very thin, fragile thing, and if you don't have strong laws and traditions, it can easily break down.
Yeah.
The current president was actually teaching at the university when we were there, and very, very excellent person. There were some really very qualified people at the university. I thought the president himself was an incredible manager. He ran meetings better than anybody I've ever seen. You know, he let people talk. I mean, if you talk about an academic meeting, and I've been in many of them over the years, they tend to follow a certain order, you know. Certain people just have to speak.
Yeah.
Even if they don't
Sometimes
really have
more
any,
than once.
even if they don't have anything really new to add to the conversation, and he just had a way of, and sometimes even if it's totally off point for the issue that has to be decided, you know, but he just had a way of letting, you know, a certain amount of that go on, and then bringing everything back to the conclusion. I was never able quite to emulate him exactly, but it was very impressive. I learned a lot from that, Mr. Weeks, and we had a good time in Liberia. My wife learned to cook African food, and she got interested in African textiles, and has become since quite an expert in that field. And but one of the other class I was asked to teach at the law school was legal methods, which was
sort of research,
analysis, research,
type
writing.
thing, yeah.
And the research part was difficult because they had a room they called a library, and they had a woman in it called a librarian, but they had no books. So I got involved in writing letters to a lot of schools back in the States saying, send me any old books you got, you know. And that didn't work very well, but I worked very closely with the university librarian, and the dean of the Pittsburgh Library School was a consultant to the university. And I happened to meet him at a reception for him, organized by the university library. You know, maybe 6 months before we were due to leave Liberia. He asked what it was I was going to do next year, and I said, well, I'm going to go back to Minnesota and practice law. And he says, well, do you ever think of becoming a librarian? Come to Pitt and I'll give you a scholarship. And we thought about it, and I thought, that was interesting. I enjoyed, one of my parents' good friends was a librarian, and I thought the librarian at Minnesota had some interesting classes. He taught comparative law for one thing, and I thought that might be fun to do. And so I said, all right, let's do that. And so we flew to Pittsburgh. I think it was New Year's Day, 1970. And Harold Oncourt, he was the dean. He met us at the airport, took us to his home. We spent 2 or 3 nights with him until we could find an apartment. My wife went out and bargained for an apartment. That is, she didn't take the first price. She said, well, we're just out of the Peace Corps, we can only pay $25 less than that. And the guy said, oh, okay.
Oh, nice. Good thing she tried to bargain.
Which I thought that was, I wouldn't have done it, but, you know.
Well, I imagine he wasn't used to people
No.
dickering on the price.
But she was a great bargainer, still is. And then, you know, the school opened, and I went over to the school and I registered. That was no problem. And I went to the financial aid office and asked for my scholarship. I said, well, we don't see you here. He said, well, I just spent a couple of days with Dean Oncourt, and you know, he promised me a scholarship when we met in Africa. As soon as I said Africa, they thought, oh. And I turned to this other file, you know. They pulled out my folder, and
They did have you.
And oh, here you are. And says, and then they looked at me and said, but you can't have this money. So they found me a work-study position compiling public library statistics for Pennsylvania. And I worked for Frank Sessa, who later became the president of ALA. And I now say I'm the only Norwegian American ever to be offered a minority scholarship at Pennsylvania, at Pitt. But of course I didn't get one. So.
Well, you were offered one.
I was offered one.
It's when they looked at the paper they said you can't have this or something.
That's right.
Yeah.
But I did learn a lot about Pennsylvania geography. I think Pennsylvania has the funniest names for towns of any state I've encountered. Just a whole bunch of weird, most of them I've forgotten by now, but you know, Upper Marion and all these strange things. You know, everywhere there's a public library, they had a town. Would have to compile these things. And Pitt was an interesting school. It was a very large school at the time for a library school, 500 students. I think Dean Oncourt used to say, after Moscow, you know, we're the biggest library school in the world. Things have probably changed, but one of the reasons it was so large was that it had 3 tracks. It had librarianship, it had information science, and he had communications.
All right.
So we were in there with the computer jocks and the
Now, this was pretty
and
early
the,
on
and the PR
for those
and, you know,
folks.
and the PR people, you know,
Yeah.
and it was, but it was, and we had to take some classes in every track.
Mhm.
And so I took a couple the computer classes, and I remember going down in the middle of the night to the Pittsburgh Computer Center with my punch cards and
Mhm.
running programs, trying to get this little, you know, library system I designed for African literature to work. And you know, it's interesting because I think the University Computer at the time was something called a PDP-11,
Mhm.
which has had less computing power than my laptop does now.
Maybe even your phone is more powerful than
It could be.
was. Yeah.
It could be. But it was a very good experience because you know, when computers started to hit law libraries,
Mhm.
I had some familiarity with them. I wasn't afraid of them. You know, I had a little knowledge of the jargon. In library school, I also had to take you know, some technical services classes, and that was helpful.
Mhm.
I took classification from Philip Imroth, which was a really interesting class. And it really, I think it was the most intellectually challenging class I ever took, more than anything in law school.
Was he using Dewey Decimal System at that point?
No, he was teaching all systems.
Because Dewey always sort of struck me, we studied that in library school, was sort of built on the hierarchy of knowledge and it was very systematic in a lot
Yeah,
of
well, that
ways.
was the thing, and we learned the Universal Decimal System, which is popular
Right.
in Europe,
Yes.
but we also learned LC, and Class K had just come out,
Mhm.
so I wrote a paper on Class K, which he was very, very happy to get, and
Mhm.
explained how Class K was an anomaly among other LC systems, being geographic first and subject
Yeah.
later, which totally anathema, but
Well,
that was the reason.
How we're organized is the law.
But that was the reason it was delayed for almost 50 years, I
Yes,
think.
it was a long
Because
time.
the lawyers said, I'm sorry, you can't take, you know, your traditional system and put it on the lot. We don't arrange law books that way.
Well, even Class K, one of its predecessors was Los Angeles County. They
Yeah.
had a Class K, which they built and
I
it
think
was
LC
in
copied, basically.
some use for a while, and then finally
Yeah.
when LC came up with their official version,
Mhm.
we mostly switched over, but there was a lot of similarity.
But it took, many, many years before lawyers could get the first one, and then many more years to get the rest of them. And you know, it was at Harvard that we finally helped Yolanda Goldberg and the others finish off LC, because it was the religious systems and the ancient law, the Roman and canon law systems, that were really causing them some difficulty. But we had a couple of faculty members that were happy to help them work through it, and I think LC is finally complete.
Is it? Well, I know KF came out, and that was Anglo-American law,
Mhm.
but then they started having to add all the other schedules. And
Yep, and the national systems were not so bad, and then
No.
they changed JX to KX. you
I
know.
remember when that happened.
And then,
We're
but-
not computerized yet, so making those changes was
Yeah.
not a small undertaking.
No, and then the canon law and Islamic law, and those were tricky little systems, but I think they finally finished those. And that was interesting, being able to talk to catalogers, being able to talk to computer people.
We've talked a little bit about your career, but for those who perhaps are not familiar with it, could we sort of backtrack just
Sure.
a tiny bit? You've talked about being a library student in Pittsburgh. You have mentioned being a lawyer in Minnesota. Could you talk about your undergraduate and law degrees a little bit and where you got them?
I went to Harvard undergraduate, I was expected to go to Carleton College because
What, Minnesota?
my father and my grandparents had gone to Carleton, and was expected I would go there, and I did apply and I did get admitted. My mother had gone to St. Olaf in the same town.
Uh-huh.
But my high school counselor said, you know, you should apply to Harvard. So I did apply to Harvard, and I got in and went there, and it was a very interesting experience. I'm not sure I wouldn't have been better off going to Carleton first and maybe Harvard later, but I did have a good time at Harvard. The Harvard Band, which is an insane group, but it kept me sane anyway because I had some outlet. And then I kept getting letters. Every year I'd get a letter from the University of Minnesota Law School saying, well, when you're finished, you know, and you're thinking about what to do next, consider law school and consider Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
And I took the graduate record exam and I took the LSAT, and you know, looking at the scores of both, it was very clear I should go to law school.
No, better chance, huh?
Better chance. And so I went back to Minnesota and you know, did 3 years at the law school there.
Uh-huh.
And right after that, went into the Peace Corps. In the Peace Corps, you know, got the connection with Pitt, went to library school. And after a year in Pittsburgh, started to think about, you know, where could I get a job?
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to be in a large library. I thought I'd learn more in a large, even
Now,
if I was a
had you-
small cog in a big
Had
machine.
you already decided you were going to be a law librarian, or were you
Yeah,
not there yet? On that?
No, I assumed that that's what
All
I.
right. Well, with
I
the law
thought.
background
Sure.
and so on, yeah.
And so I went through the directory,
Mhm.
you know, and looking at the places that had the big collections,
Mhm.
and noticed that Texas had a big collection, at least on paper.
Mhm.
I found out later it might have been a somewhat chimerical.
A little bigger on paper than in
Yes.
reality. I don't think they
We can
were
talk-
all
we can talk
alone
about-
on that.
We can talk about that, but
Oh.
and we had met a Fulbright fellow
Uh-huh.
at the University of Liberia from Texas. So I called him up. You know, he was teaching at the law school, and so I called him up in Austin, and I said, "What do you think the chances are of Texas having a library position open?"
Mhm.
And he said, "Texas always has a library position open," which I didn't pick up on. And he says, "I'll have the director call you." So I get a call from Roy Mirsky,
Roy Mirsky, yeah.
and we talk for half an hour on the phone, and he offers me a job. He says,
Uh-huh.
"Come down, you be a reference librarian. Pay you $12,000 a year." Well,
Yeah, he was known for extremely high compensation for these people. but-
No, and he wasn't gonna waste money on. Well, it turned out that like 5 years later, he offered Virginia Wise the same amount of money for the same job. So he hadn't changed. So we threw everything in a U-Haul and drove down to Austin,
Uh-huh.
Texas. And one of the cylinders on the U-Haul gave out in Dallas, and so we kind of limped into Austin on New Year's Day, 1972. Found a motel,
Uh-huh.
walked into a very large restaurant. This was near the university. Walked into a very large restaurant and found that every other table had a television set next to it,
Oh.
which was tuned to the, I think it was the Notre Dame Texas game.
Oh.
And as we left the dinner and went back to our room, we looked up and we saw the UT Tower,
Mhm.
you know, with the lights on it. My wife says, "Oh, that's where that shooting took place, wasn't
That's
it?"
right, that wasn't too many years before that.
No, very shortly
Uh,
before
a
that. And
fellow
so she,
did that.
you know, my wife is not a football fan.
Mhm.
And so here we are in Texas and football, tower, and she was thinking, what are we doing in Austin? You know?
Well, you'd sort of gone, I suppose, from winter up north, and suddenly it wasn't quite winter where you were.
No, it was
This
that
is
was
January.
pleasant. Yeah, and so, but you know, within a couple of weeks, she had a job as a nurse, which she had originally been trained for,
Mhm.
and she was plucked to work in the operating room by the top operating room nurse in Austin, Texas. And she'd never even been in an operating room before. And Norma White, who hired her, said, that's perfect. You're exactly what I want. I want to train the people who work
No
for
bad
me.
habits from the other
That's right. And Molly loved working for Norma White. And
Uh-huh.
they started, I think, the first freestanding surgical center in the U.S., and Norma was asked to come and run it, and she took Molly over and had a great time. So, you know, within a month or two, we really liked Austin. It was a very nice town.
Did you ever get used to the Longhorns and like the football?
She's never seen a Longhorn game, so.
I thought everyone in Austin had to do
Well,
that.
I have. I mainly go for the pregame show, which is you know, it's better than anything you can find in Las Vegas, because the band really puts on a great show. The band and the jumbotron and the cheerleaders and everything, and the audience is just kind of rabid.
Well,
about the whole
football
thing.
is a big thing in Texas all
Big,
over. I
big
mean,
thing.
the high school stadiums in some
Absolutely.
places are matches for some of the ones in the colleges around
Absolutely,
the country.
absolutely.
And the fan base is probably more than a match for some.
Yeah, and every school has its own. You have to be kind of careful sometimes if you're in Lubbock or College Station or something to what color you're wearing. But it's
You know, it
it's
was
fun.
years ago, we were living in Washington, as you know, you were living there for a while. And my son was probably about 8 or 9 years old, and somehow we got him a Dallas Cowboys jacket. And of course, in those days, the Washington Redskins and the Dallas Cowboys
That's right.
were arch rivals.
That's right.
And we had to be a little careful when he wore that around when they were getting ready to have a game.
Yeah, I just like that when I go to some overseas soccer matches. I have to be kind of careful.
Yeah, some of the fans over there take their game very seriously, as in riots and such that came.
You know, if I wear a
Sure.
U.S. jersey, it's okay. You know, but you don't want to wear a Real Madrid jersey if you're in Barcelona, for instance.
And I guess in the UK, there are some cities that are pretty competitive too
Yeah.
with each other.
In the UK, Germany, Holland, it's tricky. It can be very dangerous going to soccer games. I found, however, in Spain or Greece, have been there, you take family and kids, and it's not a problem. Even after the game, you know, the fans, they just don't get in fights. But in Northern Europe, it's much more. In fact, they have groups of fans that go to the games, not to see the games, but to fight the fans from the other side.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I think they made a movie about this called The Firm with the guy who played the Hobbit.
Yeah, I haven't seen that movie, but I've read a lot about some of the riots at some of the soccer games in Europe,
Yeah,
especially.
it's a really
over the years.
it's an interesting phenomenon
Yeah.
because it has a life of its own. Really, it's unrelated to the sport.
Well, sort of speaking of interesting phenomena, you ended up at Texas working with
Yeah, that was my first
Roy
real
Mersky
library
in
job.
the library, and you've had a, shall we say, an illustrious career. I think that's putting it rather
Well,
fairly.
I've worked for 3 large schools
Yeah.
and
You want
three
to
very
sort of
good
tell
schools.
us about those a little bit? One of which, of course, in between was Georgetown, where you and
Georgetown.
I were sort of neighbors across
That's right.
town.
Well, at Texas, Page Keaton was the dean, and he's an iconic, dean figure.
Mhm.
He had one faculty meeting a year, which they voted appointments. But basically, every day that he was in town, when he wasn't out fundraising or something, every morning at 9:30, he'd have coffee in the faculty lounge, and if people wanted to talk to him, we went and talked to him there. And you know, he would take the pulse of the faculty and throw out suggestions and receive ideas and everything, and then he'd go off and make his decision. And the only thing the faculty ever voted on really was appointments, and that was at one meeting a year, and he'd say, well, we can hire 3 people next year, and we have these 7 applicants, you know, and they'd run through them and vote. And it was very very efficient. He was a well loved and deservedly so, I think, one of the great deans in American legal education, and a good scholar too. And then of course Roy was the librarian, and he'd come only a few years before actually. I thought he'd been there forever because he had a beard and it was slightly gray. And
Well, he'd come down from Colorado, I think.
Come from Colorado.
Before that, he was at the University of, or in Olympia.
Yep.
And before that, he was at Yale.
Before that, he was the associate at Yale when Mike Jacobstein was the associate at Columbia.
Ah.
And Price and Bittner were the respective directors. And those 2 associates got involved in editing Price and Bittner.
Yeah.
And when they each got their own shops, they continued to work together and develop the fundamentals of legal research. So Mike Jacobstein told me once that he enjoyed working with Roy, but they used to room together at conventions, and he hated that because Roy would always open the window and Mike would always want to shut it. So finally, when they became directors, they couldn't afford to have their own rooms, and they didn't have to fight.
Very good. So you started out with Roy.
Started out with Roy.
And then you moved on up the way to
Georgetown,
Washington, as
D.C.,
yeah.
the district. Yeah.
Yeah, the district, as we call it. I remember coming down to see you at your house at the time. You lived on Capitol Hill, which is
We did.
very, very trendy today, but it was still a changing environment.
Yeah, when we bought it, we bought it 8th and E, northeast, and it was kind of maybe a block or 2 further east than most people felt comfortable with. But we thought it would continue to develop, and for a couple of years it did.
Yeah.
And then Reagan defeated Carter, and the line began to move backwards because the Republicans all wanted to live in Virginia or Washington, and it was several years actually before that part of Washington got gentrified. But now 8th Street is, which used to be the place you'd go to buy heroin, you know, is now very trendy.
It's unbelievable. My son and I were on a cross-country road trip last fall, and we included a week or so in D.C. And we drove around in parts of town that we couldn't even recognize.
It's amazing.
The structures have all been rebuilt. Everything's modernized. The people on the street are, you know, like you'd see in the suburbs, as opposed to all people that you used to see just in the district. And
well, my wife worked at Gallaudet, and she would, you know, walk up 8th Street to Gallaudet, and I was always a little nervous about it, but she never really had any difficulty during the day. But if she had the night shift, it was, you didn't walk that at night.
Well, in addition to sort of turning Georgetown around, I think that's not speaking politely about what you did. You also did some service in the city. You and I were involved with the Law Librarian Society.
Yeah, that was very interesting. Yeah.
And we both were at different times editor of Law Library Lights. And I remember especially one incident when you were you were the editor.
Okay.
And in those days, we used lights. We didn't have the internet and all these other ways of communicating. So this was how we announced when our meetings were going to be. And when, you know, the lights didn't come out that far in advance of when the meeting was, that it would announce so people could sign up and know to come. And you had an interesting situation on across the street from the printer one time. Want to tell us a little bit about that?
You told me about that, and I don't remember.
You don't remember it?
I
Well,
don't
I
remember.
do, because I don't know if I was president at the time, but I was nervous about that notice not
I
going
think you were
out.
the president.
And what had happened was there was a group of people who had taken over some place right across the street from where our printer was.
Mhm.
And they were threatening to shoot anybody who came anywhere near the place. So the police had the whole area cordoned off, and Mike's was sitting there waiting to be picked up because it had to go to a mailing house to be sent out. And you, as editor, were supposed to go and do this, but you couldn't get in to get the issues for several days until the police finally, these people gave
Oh,
up.
goodness. You know, I don't remember that.
Well, I guess I probably do because I was worried about the meeting being an absolute disaster.
Yeah.
If
yeah,
nobody
because
would know to
show
come.
up. There was nobody to show up. It was, you know, it was a tricky time.
Mhm.
We had, I remember, shortly after our daughter was born, my wife was walking out with her I think in a stroller, and she had gone to the store, you know, was coming back. And there was these two guys behind her, and they were talking about mugging her. And then one of them said, well, no, she's got a baby, so let's not. So they just walked on past, you know.
Oh,
You know, it's the honor among thieves, I guess.
well, I guess maybe so.
And then we used to give these parties in the holidays where we had somebody who was a good piano player, and he'd come and play the piano, and we'd sing carols and have wine and cheese and so forth.
Uh-huh.
And one of the people who left, Paul Richard, who then went on to the Placement Association, he was an assistant dean at Georgetown at the time.
Mhm.
But he was mugged right around the corner from
Mhm.
our house after that party. I always felt horrible about that.
Yeah.
So it was
Let's
not
just say it
always
was a transition area in those days.
I took a class with the Smithsonian in night skating, they called it, roller skating.
Uh-huh.
I bought some roller skating. We went down to the mall and they taught us how to ride on the sidewalks and step over the cracks and everything, and that was a lot of fun. And so if it was during the day, I would sometimes skate to work, you know, because we didn't live that far away.
Yeah, you were sort
Ride
of
the
a
elevator up.
urban commuter in those days, real
Ride
close
the
to where
elevator
you
up
worked.
and then skate through technical services to my office, much to the amusement of, of the staff. And,
I'll bet.
yeah. Georgetown did require a fair amount of turning around. You know, they had a faculty member who was assigned to the library, and
Yeah, well, he was not a trained librarian, I remember.
not a trained librarian.
Nice guy and all that, but
Very nice guy.
it was just, it had grown beyond.
And the dean
that need.
the dean had renamed the library the Fred O. Dennis Library.
Oh, I remember, yeah, they were hoping to get
Because,
some sort of a big
because
gift.
Fred Dennis, who was a publisher from Buffalo
Uh-huh.
way back then, had promised a lot of money. So Paul Dean, who was the dean of Georgetown, Dean,
Yeah.
named the library. And Fred never actually came through with it, but he
So
used,
I recall.
but he used to make visits,
Uh-huh.
and he'd look at the shelves, and then after he'd go back, boxes of books would arrive, which we hadn't ordered.
Uh-huh.
But he said, "You need these," and my predecessor, you know, just didn't have the gumption to say no. And the first time I saw these, I shipped them back.
Uh-huh.
And next time he came down, I said, "You can't do this, Fred. You know, we'll pay for what we order, and if you want to make us
That's right, these were
and
not
the next
gifts.
time, if you want to make us a gift, that's fine." They were certainly well bound, but
Yeah.
I was so relieved when George Mason opened its law school,
Mhm.
new law school. His first purchase after he was appointed director of the library at George Mason was a big truck. And then he visited all of these federal sales, you know, for office furniture and shelving and
Yeah.
congressional records and things like that, and began, you know, filling up the library at George Mason, which at the time, because they hadn't built their own building, they were in an old department store. And I was so jealous because he had an escalator in the library. And
Oh, I remember that.
I thought
the
that
only
was
one
so
I ever saw
cool.
until years later. I saw another one.
I thought that was so cool. I just
Yeah.
thought, oh, if I ever design a
Well, it'd been an old department store.
put in an escalator, and but he was happy to take a lot of our, like we had 3 copies of the California State Bar Review or something.
I remember
Which-
Georgetown.
He took a lot of my
predecessor had an awful lot of volumes, but there were duplicate copies,
yes.
and of course you had a very large student body, and this was
Very
still
large.
the era of all books, so
Yeah, very
some of
large
that
student body.
duplication was probably essential. But
Some of, but not in the right places. I went out and one of the first things I did was buy 50 copies of Right on Federal Courts,
okay,
because everybody was stealing and hiding the few copies we had. And
Yeah.
yet we had 3 copies of the California State Bar Journal, which were pristine because
nobody was using them or stealing them.
So I was glad to sell a lot of our duplicates to
Oh.
him, and it was a time when technical services was being computerized and everything, and so we had a lot of basic housekeeping type stuff to do, and the staff had to be competent staff. I just had to kind of rearrange them in the right way and give them support. The physical plant was fairly new, but it didn't work. We had a lot of problems with the building. Had been built. It was designed by Edward Durrell Stone. It had a big open square in the middle of it.
Yeah, a big atrium.
So you
kind of.
come up to the library, and then the library had a big hole in the middle of its main floor.
Yeah, and you had a big stairway up
Yeah.
where you walked up.
And then
to go in.
going from one side to the, you could never just cut across. You had to go
Yeah.
all around. It was very inconvenient, and the building had been designed to run heating and air conditioning simultaneously throughout the year, which of course, the oil crisis came. It was no longer affordable.
Yeah.
So in the winter, it was hot. And one February, the students organized a bathing suit protest. They all went up to the 3rd floor of the library. There must have been 60 of them, and stripped to their bathing suits. And
You're lucky they didn't go farther.
and the student newspaper came and took pictures of everything, and it kind of made there was a very active student newspaper there.
So they couldn't turn the temperatures down very well.
If they turned it down, then the offices would freeze.
Oh.
So the classrooms were hot, the library was hot, and the offices were comfortable, because faculty have to be comfortable.
Yeah.
But we managed to, so the dean put together a small little group to work on this, and we managed to meet with the head of the physical plant, and we looked at the schematics, and we determined that we could pump air in the winter, from the library and the classrooms to some degree into the offices, and not heat the building. And the next winter, I think they spent they only turned the heat on enough to make sure that no pipes froze and things didn't turn up, but they basically didn't heat the building. They just let body heat, keep the faculty
I
warm.
imagine whoever was paying the utility bill in those days, this is the 70s, was probably most pleased.
They were. So they basically didn't heat the building. Then, of course, after I left Georgetown, Bob Oakley came in and he designed a new library, and it was a very nice library.
Yeah.
And, so Georgetown was interesting. DC was
I
in.
suspect Georgetown had also learned its lesson when they named the new library for Edward Bennett Williams.
Oh yeah,
That he had
check in hand.
had given them enough to make it well worth it.
Yeah,
Unlike
And he was also-
old Mr. Dennis.
and he was also a graduate of the school, so
He
that was
was,
very
yeah.
appropriate. And I thought that was a beautiful building. I thought they did a great
It
job.
really was, and we had the dedication. I don't know if you
I came
were
down
able
for
to
that.
come, and that was out. They had a thing out on the lawn
Mhm.
between the library and the old building, and it was really very nice, right in the middle of downtown
Yeah.
Washington DC to have
And if you
this,
went
this
up to
sort of
the-
nice setting.
You went up to the 3rd or 4th floor, one corner, you had a beautiful view of the Capitol right down the street. It
Yeah.
was, yeah, it was very nice. And now then they built more buildings after that.
Oh, it's a real little campus now.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
is. Things got very complicated, but
Yeah.
it was a good experience. But being in DC was very interesting to be a law librarian. You know, kitty corner from the government printing office, and
Yeah.
with the Library of Congress there,
There's a
and
lot of
Supreme Court
activity
there.
in our field there.
And you know, the law librarian of DC was a very active group,
Oh, the society, yes.
and very interesting to me because so many firm and federal librarians, much more interesting than many of the other chapters around the country, which tend to be dominated by the academics.
And in the days when you were there was a lot more involvement by the federal government librarians. That sort of waned a little bit over
Oh,
the
that's
years
too bad.
as the government started to withdraw support for that kind of thing by
Yeah.
librarians. But the firms sort of blossomed, and it was nice to
Yeah.
work with
Good
people
firm.
from the private sector.
But the federal libraries are very interesting, and I remember getting involved with trying to. I had to write some kind of white paper on the library, why we should have a national law library. You know,
Mhm.
help the Law Library of Congress become.
Oh, I remember that when you.
But that was kind of I thought the Law Library of Congress was not the most functional environment. Maybe the Library of Congress wasn't the most functional environment. Very complicated.
Yeah.
Boy, they have wonderful collections and some incredibly competent people, but it's such a big organization, and you know, it's the elephant to the citizens of the United States. Everybody sees something in it that they want, and it's really hard to meet all of those changes. But Georgetown was a good experience. I think if we had our daughter was born in DC, and I think if we had been more confident of the schooling, we might have stayed there.
Yeah, probably would have had to put her in a private setting at that time.
Yeah, I suppose I think we would have had to, but that kind of goes against the grain. Both my
Yeah.
teachers
Or
being,
move to the suburbs,
both my kids
where
being
the
public.
schools were better.
Yeah. Well, we kind of liked where we were, and
Yeah, well, the
Then
traffic in
Harvard
DC,
came
even in
calling.
those days,
Days wasn't very easy to navigate at rush hours.
No.
We're lucky there.
no.
So Harvard called and you